Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. We'll be talking about what's happening here in Turkey and US relations. Now, Turkey's National Security Council meeting that was held on Tuesday said it will establish a peace corridor in Syrian territory to ensure border security against increased threats and will clear the region from all terrorist elements. Now, this is according to the press release they issued later that day. Also, late Tuesday night, a Turkish convoy of 12 vehicles, a military convoy carrying armored vehicles and commando units, arrived in the southeast province of the country, which borders Syria. Now, Turkey's leaders have said Ankara might have to launch a third counter-terror operation into Syria after two other ones that they had already done in 2016. Now, this is coming at a time when US threatens Turkey with sanctions over its purchase of Russian S-400s, an advanced Russian anti-air missile system. Since March 2011, fighting in Syria has killed an estimated 465,000 people. It's injured more than 1 million, and it's forced half the pre-war population from their homes. So situation is quite dire, but the tensions between the US and their NATO ally, they continue to simmer and don't make what is happening in Syria any better. So we're going to be talking about how this is affecting the peace in the region and what will the way forward look like from now on. Let me just introduce our guests who are joining us to comment on this. We have with us Dr. Yahya al-Aridi, Syrian politician, joining us from Istanbul. And also we have with us Mr. Michael Arnold, an analyst, joining us from Istanbul. Welcome to both of you to Newswire. I want to start with you, Dr. Yahya al-Aridi, especially on this current move that we have seen from the Turkish Military Council. How do you see this?
Well, this is within the context of Turkey trying hard to create a buffer zone, a safe zone, a neutral zone, call it whatever you like, for a long time, due to certain national security concerns on the part of Turkey. It talked to the United States and to the allies, and responsiveness on their part was quite weak. As such, Turkey must have thought that it could do this on its own. And this really worries me, that Turkey would not be able to do that without real coordination between her and the other allies in NATO, the alliance in northeastern Syria, and at the same time with its new partner, Russia. So all these things need to be taken into consideration. Now, the impact or the repercussions of such a move, or the influence of such an act, would be on the population, hopefully positively, by creating a safe corridor that would prevent those who are called terrorists by Turkey from penetrating into its territory, right, or creating problems for Turkey. However, the issue is being settled on Syrian grounds, and this is what matters for Syrians. Everybody is settling their problems on Syrian ground. And if we look at the problems that Syrians have encountered during the past 9 years, we notice that this is an extra problem being created before them.
Right, the breakdown between the talks between Turkey and Russia, that resulted in a 3-month now ongoing airstrikes by the regime and their allies, the Russians. I mean, there are 3 million people there in Idlib. So many have died, hundreds have died, thousands and thousands have been displaced. The question really is, while they battle it out on an international spectrum, the price that the Syrians are paying, nobody seems to be accounting for that. Is it, you said, interestingly enough, earlier on the special envoy, who is now been replaced by Mr. Jeffrey, that he should have known that Bashar al-Assad is not interested in peace in the region. Is the situation still like that?
Well, if we are talking about the northwestern area of Idlib, northern Hama, and southern Idlib, east of Latakia, this area is under fire for the past 3 months, right, starting 23rd of April. And this is part of, it was supposed to be part of the de-escalation area, which was agreed upon in Astana. However, the regime and those who support the regime, be they Iran or Russia, are supporting it to this invasion and creating all sorts of horrors there. They are using all kinds of weapons, heavy weapons. Sukhois are all the time and around the clock over that area. They turned it into ruins. And this was supposed to be a de-escalation area. In other words, the Russians signed something and they are ready to break it and to violate it immediately, which suppresses their main intention in Syria. They came there, as you know, in 2015, and they said it's a matter of 3 months and they would quieten the area. Unfortunately, they have been there for almost 4 years and they have devastated the country in order to keep this brutal regime against the will of Syrian people, against the will of the international community.
Right. Doctor, tell us this. What can you tell us about the constitutional committee that was agreed upon by the regime? You are also part of the 50 people representing the opposition. Is that correct?
It is correct. And this is another thing which is pertinent or part of the political track, which the Russians and the regime and the Iranians talk a lot about, but when it comes to practicality, to implementation, they are doing other things.
Okay, so you're saying, are you telling me there's been no progress at all made as part of this constitutional committee?
There was some sort of progress regarding the rules and procedures for the work of such a committee in terms of membership. There was a difference, or with regard to 6 names, there was an agreement that this issue would be settled. However, this is we noticed that the political process, in particular the Constitutional Committee, is being used as an umbrella or as a pretext in order to carry out such brutal matters on the part of Russia. And this is really creating problems for Syrians. Those who are oppressing, or those who are using weapons, those who are destroying everything, talk a lot about political solution, but at the same time, what they do on the ground is kill and destroy.
So there seems to be a genuine intention missing. Okay, so Mr. Arnold, let me ask you about this, would you say that there has been some sort of breakdown or a complete breakdown of trust between the US and Turkey, because it seems that Turkey is ready for another attack in northeastern Syria?
Yeah, I think there's been a lack of trust for some time between Turkey and the United States. I mean, look, ultimately, this issue is being raised again, but it's not a particularly new issue. There may be some new dynamics now, but this has been ongoing for a while. Turkey's been determined to shift the status quo in northeast area for some time, and a large part that's rooted in both strategic and national security concerns that they feel that the United States has done very little to assuage. So there's definitely a lack of trust on this and other issues between Turkey and the United States.
Right, and the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria, James Jeffrey, he went last week for the latest round of negotiations. Like you mentioned, these have been going on for a while now, to establish some kind of buffer zone in northeast Syria. Now, despite that, we have heard President Erdogan come out and say that whatever the outcome of these talks, we're still going to attack. So is this a kind of a leverage that President Erdogan is using at a time where they are facing possible sanctions?
That's one way it could be interpreted. I think, we don't necessarily have the insight into the internal workings to really make that determination, but it's a possibility. But at the end of the day, I mean, if we look at the results of the last round of negotiations, I believe the Americans offered a 5 to 10 kilometer buffer zone. Turkey's request is 30 to 40 kilometers, so they remain far apart on what they actually want to see in that area. Furthermore, Turkey wants to have exclusive, authority in that area, and that's not something that the United States is ready to agree to. And I think part of that pressure is coming from their YPG allies in the region as well, who, for their own obvious reasons, would not want to see that.
And the buffer zone that the U.S. is looking to protect in northeast Syria is essentially where the Syrian Kurdish People's Protection Units, the YPG, are situated. And these are allies of the U.S. So this is something that has been an ongoing issue with them, because Turkey feels that these are the reason why there's a security threat in Turkey, having them so close. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, it goes a bit deeper than that. I mean, aside from the direct threat of having them along the border, the longer term and more strategic issue for Turkey is the fact that, if they retain authority in the area, the links between the YPG and the PKK are acknowledged even by those who support the YPG. And so for Turkey, this is a potential issue of the PKK, of course, is operating insurgency inside of Turkey, of having, a strategic base along the border. So it's a major concern for them.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Mr. Arnold, joining us there from Istanbul. Coming back to you, Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, when something like this is transpiring on the borders of Syria, northeastern Syria specifically, what, in your opinion, is the stance that Assad's regime and Russia, their allies, have in terms of protecting the Syrians, or what stake do they have?
Well, they have a real problem with that because they know that, for instance, the northwestern area in Syria, they are ready to invade. And for 3 months, they have been doing this, shelling and killing people, destroying medical centers, schools, markets, bazaars, etc., etc. However, when it comes to the northeastern area, where the alliance exists and practices and works against Daesh and these things, these are areas that they cannot come close to. That is another issue. It just constitutes a real burden, a real problem for them. However, there is a Kurdish issue, a chronicle one. For a long time, Kurds in Syria were denied basic rights by this regime. And they found themselves, the Kurds found themselves fighting Daesh and with alliance with the United States, and that helped them. However, the Turkish element coming into the overall picture also complicated the issues for everyone, for the regime, for the Russians, for the Americans, for the alliance, and even for Turks themselves, because the United States at one time said that it would withdraw its forces from that area, and there was chaos, and because there must be a certain party to fill up the vacuum. And it was thought at a certain time that the Russians and the regime would fill up that, and it was impossible. Because also there is a sixth element, which is the Syrian opposition, the Free Syrian Army, which is supposedly responsible for in charge of just getting into that place and protecting it and making the people decide on their own destiny and administer their own affairs. Now, things are really getting complicated day after day. However, if there is a real will on the part of the international community, there could be implementation of the Security Council resolution, be they the Geneva Communique or the 2254, and which calls for a political transition in Syria. And as such, people themselves would determine their own destiny if they were in the northeastern area, Syria, or northwestern, and in other places.
But the problem with that is, and just for the sake of saving time here, I'm going to get to what I'm guessing you're going to say is that the militants are the problem here, which the regime says are militants, of course, since they want to eliminate them and they can't do it alone. They have to pull in international intervention. So clearly there is going to be a lot of roadblocks in bringing anything that you're proposing possible.
Yeah, well, roadblocks because of the militant element is true. But when there is a real will, and those militants, those foreigners, for instance, they should go to their home countries. We don't want them, and they don't belong here, and they were used by the regime as a pretext to kill civilians. And the same thing applies to Russia, which said that with its interference in Syria, that it was coming to Syria to fight terrorism.
Okay.
Actually, terrorism was not targeted by Russia, but civilians were targeted. The hospitals were hit, medical centers, schools, etc. That was what happening in Syria.
Okay, so hold that thought, Dr. Yahya. I'll come back. I want to introduce here Mr. Bilal Salaymeh. He is a researcher at the CETA Foundation of Foreign Policy Research. He's joining us from Ankara. Mr. Bilal, welcome to Newswire. Let me ask you this. While what is happening in Syria is, as you heard our guest talk about the internal issues here, those involved internationally are also fighting out their battles in Syria. Now, President Trump proved recently that he was a reliable ally to Turkey by putting off the sanctions for a while, at least, on the issue of the S-400s. Of course, they're still looming over Turkey's head. Now, despite the pressure that President Trump faced from those 45 Republican senators who wanted the sanctions on Turkey according to the law, but this relationship right now is on tenterhooks. Would you say that this is sustainable or not?
Well, I think this is sustainable. The relation between Mr. Trump and Turkish President Mr. Erdogan is somehow keeping the relation between the two countries on some good levels. But the point is not with the Trump the problem. The problem itself is the establishment in the United States. So while, for example, Mr. Trump in his telephone call with Mr. Erdogan said that I'm going to withdraw the American soldier from northeastern Syria, but on the other hand, we saw that the establishment, the Pentagon, CENTCOM, and the others establishments, institutions in the United States, military and security institutions, they opposed this withdrawal. At the same thing, for example, we are saying that, for example, last week, James Jeffrey, the American Special Representative for Syria, he came to Ankara and was contacting the diplomatic circles here in Ankara. But at the same time, the CENTCOM general went to Kobani and met the head of PYD, which is affiliated to PKK. So the problem is not with Mr. Trump by himself or the White House. The problem is between the institutions, and there is an anti-Turkish position in the establishment of the United States, and here is the problem, I think.
So this situation, it's still unprecedented in a way that Ankara has been a long-term ally of the U.S. I mean, it's 70 plus years of a relationship. But when they turn around and they go buy advanced weapons from Russia, doesn't this kind of show a rift that might not be that easily repairable?
Okay, but the problem here is not with Turkish side, I don't think. I think that the problem is within the United States and with the American position. The United States, in its policy in Syria especially, they didn't care about or take into considerations the security concern, the national security concern for Turkey by supporting PKK, YPG, that Turkey designated as terror organization, and is considered by the United States itself and European Union as terrorist organization. So the Turkish politicians and decision makers think that they are being not treated in the equal steps and stands by the Americans, and at the same time that the United States is violating the logic of strategic partnership and the logic of being at the same under the same umbrella of NATO by supporting terrorist organizations that threaten the national security of Turkey. So after that, and when the United States started to support those terrorist organizations, and not only PKK, I want to mention also the terrorist organization of Fattah, which is designated as terrorist organization here in Turkey, and Turkey saying that this group is behind the coup d'etat attempt in July 2016, and the head of this terrorist organization, Fethullah Gulen, is settled in the United States. So these points make or perceived here in Ankara as if the United States is not a partner for Turkey. At opposite side is trying to weaken Turkey and Turkish position, regional position in the region. So
it's fair to say, Mr. Bilal, sorry to interrupt you there. So it's fair to say that Ankara is running out of patience here with these almost seen as some reports say, delaying tactics through these talks where they want to establish a buffer zone, yet nothing concrete is coming across, or so it seems.
Yeah, exactly. For example, James Jeffrey, he came here to Ankara and met with the Turkish diplomats and also with the military staffs for almost 5 times. But he is continue to talk the talk, but not walk the walk, as they said. So,
and what we're seeing in turn is that Turkey is getting closer to Russia, something that bothers Washington a lot. I mean, what we've heard.
I would not say that like this, but is Turkey trying to keep its relation, balancing its relation with the United States by enhancing its relation with Russia, with China, for example, at the same time. So I would not say that Turkey is going to reapproach the Russian on behalf of its relation. As opposite to its relation with the United States. Turkey wants to balance its relation with the two parts and want to pursue its independent foreign policy, regional foreign policy in the region, and not to continue bandwagoning the United States. And the problem is the United States officials want Turkey and Ankara to just bandwagon United States and follow its regional policy. Turkey wants to follow a more independent foreign policy that take after its national concern, national security concern.
All right. And Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, let me bring you back into what this narrative that our guest just gave us. What does the regime and Russia say or have while being stuck in the crosshairs of this diplomatic crosshairs of what Turkey and US is going through? What do you think can they take advantage of this situation right now?
Well, the larger the rift between the United States and Turkey, which is a historical ally, part of NATO, the happier the Russians would be. This is a fact. And they are trying their best in order to bridge all sorts of possible gaps between them, that's Turkey and Russia, in order to just isolate Turkey, possibly, make it detached from NATO, weaken it. All these things are happening on the part of Russia, though they claim that they are developing alliance with regard to regional issues, political ones, with regard to Astana. However, Russia knows that, for instance, there is a military base, an American military base in Turkey, which is what is the name of the military base? Angelic military base, which is part of the NATO.
Yes.
No one can ignore that. So the relationship between the United States and Turkey is so strong. And however the Russians try to detach or create a rift between the two countries, they would not be able. This is the issue of the S-400, and just parallel to the F-35 to be part of the arsenal of Turkey.
So you think Russia will not be able to take advantage, considering that the strength of the relationship between US and Turkey, as you think, is way too strong for them to make a dent? Okay.
Right. Well, this is strategically this is the case.
Strategically, that is the case.
To tactics or techniques and playing politics,
right,
with regard to minor or regional issues, the story is different. We are talking strategically with concerning Turkey. Turkey is a very valuable member of NATO.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, joining us from Istanbul, and also Mr. Bilal Salaymeh, who was joining us from Ankara. And that's all the time we have for this story. But stay tuned, because we've got more coming up from Sudan after this break. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, after 5 protesters, 4 of which were students in their teens, were shot dead by snipers in the city of El Obeid, 250 miles south of Khartoum, academic activities in Sudan have been suspended indefinitely. But that's not the only thing that has been suspended. As a result of this firing and this horrible killing of these students, opposition forces have also cancelled talks with the Transitional Military Council leaders. This month, the TMC had finally agreed to the establishment of a transitional government, which would have comprised of 5 military and 6 civilians to lead the country for a period of 3 years until elections were held. Now, as a result of this shooting, more protests have broken out across Sudan. Time is at this, the TMC has, in an unusual move, also condemned the gunning down of these students. They've said it is regrettable, it is horrible, and they're looking into it for an investigations. The talks on the issue were due to resume on Tuesday, but after a team of negotiators from the Freedom of Change Party, they traveled to inspect the site where the students were killed. They said that depending on the assessment that they come across, only then talks will be delayed. But when they got there, they decided that this was a completely unasked for, a complete mass murder of these innocent students. They were protesting for water shortages. They were protesting for basically basic human rights, very peacefully marching. And as a result, they were shot down. By whom and why? And what does this do to this landmark deal that was finally agreed upon by the opposition forces in the military? We'll be talking to our guests about that. But first, let me introduce Mr. Tom Rhodes, a journalist joining us from Nairobi in Kenya. Mr. Tom, tell us a little about the situation that has unfolded, this peaceful march that turned bloody, and 4 students lost their lives.
Yeah, I mean, it is very, very tragic. If I could just correct you, actually, it's five students were killed in this attack on Monday. And like you say, I mean, it was unprovoked. There's a lot of stories coming in from different angles, you know, some pointing the finger towards the security forces, others claiming it's members of the former ruling party. But, you know, the people want answers, and there's protests, as you say, all over the country because of this. If I could just quickly add, I mean, this is not the first time that there's been a bloody crackdown on protesters. And this has become a part of a pattern. It's happened at least 4 times.
June 3rd massacre was the most recent one. And it ended badly. I mean, there were more protests that took place. There was a conflict over the numbers, how many were dead. The military gave a different number. The opposition parties gave a completely different number. But having said that, coming to a point where it seemed so close to peace, or the situation to coming to a sort of a peaceful conclusion, how does this become a setback to the situation, this recent incident of violence?
It's definitely a setback. I mean, there was a lot of promising signs that we were seeing in Addis through the negotiation process, like you say. However, I'm told by people in Ethiopia that the more technical wings of the government are continuing, and the negotiations are, albeit at a slower pace, still continuing. So there is hope. Okay. I suppose, without giving too much of a sort of a fig leaf, it is also encouraging, of course, to see the quick reaction from the TMC denouncing the violence.
All right. Let me also introduce another guest, Yasir Arman, the deputy head of Sudan's People Liberation Movement North. Mr. Arman, let me get your take on this situation. Very recently, we were looking at a landmark deal between the military and the opposition parties. Now 5 people are dead, out of which 4 were students, and protests have broken out across Sudan. What is your comment on this?
Well, first of all, the military council has bought a lot of time not transferring the power to the civilian government, and not also combating and taking drastic decision against the old system. That all led to this situation, to the chaos, to killing civilians who are peacefully demonstrating. We condemn that, and we are asking the military council to transfer power to the civilian and to conclude the negotiations so that our country witness democracy, peace, and equal citizenship for everybody.
Do you feel that the military council in its faith is not quite honest right now, that these are delaying tactics?
Well, I believe there is a delaying tactics, and yet also We should admit that it is a complex situation, but the main issue here, the military council should conclude the negotiation with the forces of democracy and change, including the Sudan Revolutionary Front, so that we bring peace and democracy together to our country. It is time now, because all this announcement about coups and what is taking place right now from the old system, trying to torpedo the revolutions, and from the counter-revolutions, it all require drastic measure to transfer power to civilians and to end dictatorship and to move from war to peace and from totalitarianism to democracy and to multicultural.
So when General Abdul Fattah al-Burhan comes out and commenting on this horrible incident where 4 teenagers died, and he said this was extremely unregrettable and that it will be investigated, the UN has called out and said that this should be investigated and the perpetrators put behind bars. It seems that from reports coming out that the RSF was behind these, were the gunmen behind these deaths. So is there a sense of General Burhan not having that kind of control across the board, that there are renegade factions within the military?
As you know, this is not the first incident, and this is not the first announcement that they are going to investigate and they are going to punish. But impunity is what is carrying the day. The crime went unpunished for, including the attack on the strike site, which more than 100 young guys and women has been killed in a cold blood. So we need an action. Action speaks louder than words.
Right. There is a lot of mistrust, as we are sensing, from just freedom of change parties, but also it must concern you a lot. You are right now in London, and during the deposed President Omar AlBashir's time, you were sentenced to death in absentia. Is there been any kind of negotiation with the current Military Transitional Council that might be waived off and you may be able to once again resume your duties in Sudan?
Yes, last week the chair of our organizations met with the deputy chairperson of the military council, and they agreed to drop the sentence in absentia against us, and they agreed that to include the Addis Ababa agreement on peace into the political declaration and the constitutional declarations. If that happens, we will be again able to go from exile to our country. We are eager to this moment to participate in the political process inside our country and with our peoples.
And tell us a little, as the deputy head of Sudan People's Liberation Movement North, what are your party's goals and aims that you're hoping to achieve once you are part of this integral setup geared towards democracy?
Our party is calling for a new Sudan with a new socio-political, cultural, social dispensation. A Sudan that is for equal citizenship, a Sudan that is non-sexist, non-racial, non-racial country, a Sudan that for social justice and democratizations, and we are a Pan-African movement, a secular movement that stands with the core values of the revolutions for realizing freedom, social justice and equal citizenship and peace, comprehensive peaceful settlement.
So then tell me this, Mr. Armand, if and when your party comes into power, becomes part of the new democratic government in Sudan, which we are all hoping would happen soon, what would be your goals and aims in terms of how to deal with the paramilitary force, the RSF, that gets a lot of heat for their actions?
Well, as you know, we are part of the big alliance of the these coalitions of democracy and change, which is right now leading the revolutions. Our goals are clear. We need restructuring of the Sudanese state, including the security sector. Should be restructured. We need a professional army that reflects the interests and reflects the diversity of our country.
And are you concerned of the visit that has just taken place, a meeting with the Egyptian president, does that concern you at all? Do you think this has anything to do with the incidents, the peace deal sort of almost going off track here?
Well, as you know, our relation with Egypt is historical, and we have a channel with the Egyptian government. We are discussing with them. And Egypt has an interest in the stability of Sudan, but this stability, it should be for democratizations of Sudan, for comprehensive peaceful settlement. I myself, I visited Egypt recently, and we are discussing with the Egyptian government, with the region, so that Sudan could transit to a civilian government.
Right, and now that these protests are taking place after 5 people were gunned down in Al-Ubaid, what do you think is the future of that very volatile peace deal or the sort of deal established between the opposition and the Transitional Military Council?
Well, the Transitional Military Council, first of all, they should have to dismantle the old regime organs, including the Popular Defense Force, the many private security agencies that are killing people, and they have to punish for this crime, and they have to allow peaceful demonstrations, and they have to abide by the rule of law, and they have to punish whoever did this killing, and to move into transferring power to a civilian government.
Okay. All right, Mr. Yasir Arman, thank you so much for giving us your time. Speaking to us from London, joining us, Ms. Tagreed Abdin, she's an activist joining us from Khartoum. Welcome to Newswire, Ms. Tagreed. What is your take on what has just happened now? As we know, there are conflicting reports on who was behind these attacks on these 5 students in Al-Ubaid, and also at a time where the country was almost recently celebrating a landmark deal with the TMC.
I just wanted to point out regarding the conflicting numbers, what we heard yesterday were that they were 4 students and there was 1 adult, a 30-year-old man. And we're hearing more reports of deaths today of people succumbing to their injuries that took place during the crackdown on the protests yesterday.
There were reports of 62 people injured in this firing incident in Al-Ubaid. Is that the same number that you heard?
Those are the numbers I'm hearing, yes. But I was reading today reports of another person that had a head injury that died today, in addition to several more injuries pouring in.
And as a result, there have been protests all across Sudan now because of this incident. What is the situation like in Khartoum?
Yesterday, the students came out, they protested, they filled the streets. They were moving from school to school, bringing each other out. And then they started setting up roadblocks. So they were demonstrating, they were calling for justice and an investigation. And in the end, they set up roadblocks towards the evening that actually, they were very effective. Almost all major roads in Khartoum, for example, were closed yesterday. And we've seen video of the students coming out in other cities. So by the evening, the Ministry of Education had suspended school. Initially, they're stating that schools will be closed until Eid break, which starts next Thursday. But in truth, it's anybody's guess when schools will open again. Right. I just wanted to add that regarding I just wanted to add regarding the suspension of talks. The African mediators just held a press conference in the past hour, saying that talks will resume and some meetings are expected this afternoon.
That's a really positive sign. And why do you think this has the opposition has agreed to talks, considering that spirits were really dampened after this incident? And in fact, it was one of the senior members of the Sudanese Professionals Association who said the military council has gotten addicted to shedding blood of citizens and to committing massacres.
Exactly, but I think that this time they came back to the table because simply we can't trust the military council to carry out any form of objective or effective investigation regarding the crimes that are being committed. So I believe that the Forces for Freedom of Change, the opposition leaders that are negotiating on behalf of the people, see that this is the only way to actually take hold of government and able to start enacting justice.
Okay. And Mr. Rhodes, now that this talks are supposedly back on track, which is obviously a very good sign, but would you say that considering that the investigation and the announcement of a conviction of 17 military personnel was rejected by the opposition parties, it kind of shows that there is very little faith in the TMC for being able to carry out any objective, fair investigation?
Absolutely. I mean, the investigation for the June 3rd attack has been completely denounced by the public and the TMC, and the FFC in general. But we all knew from the beginning that it would be a spurious investigation. I mean, there is a lot of distrust towards the TMC. But I would also add just briefly that, there's also a lot of distrust within the TMC itself. And I think that might be another reason why they're willing to resume the negotiations quite so readily, because I think it's understood that, that it isn't one solid body acting in one single direction.
Right. Ms. Abdin, if I could get your comments on, there are reports coming out that there is a kind of a dysfunction within the military itself, the TMC itself, especially when it comes to Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan, the Deputy Chief of the Military Council, and how he conducts things. He's also the head of the RSF. Do you agree with this analysis, and what more can you tell us about it?
The fact is that generally speaking, there's a perception that there is discord within the TMC. General Hamdan, which is the acting vice president for the DMC that leads the Rapid Support Forces. The Rapid Support Forces are generally very unpopular within Sudan because they are deemed as an undisciplined militia or mercenary force. The fact that the military insists on bringing them in and actually raising them and promoting them to a very high degree. There's a veritable PR campaign going on with the RSF visiting schools and visiting hospitals and passing out whether it's medical supplies or whatever people need, for example, in schools, copybooks. So there's a PR campaign that's going on to polish the image of the RSF. But the truth is that they remain highly unpopular, and the only popularity that they do have is considered bought, so to speak, paid for.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Abdin, joining us from Khartoum. Let me come back to you, Mr. Rhodes. We're talking about how the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, have been trying to work out a PR campaign, trying to gain some popularity back. But is this a historical sort of reputation that they have earned for being trigger-happy, so to speak, and being responsible for most of the massacres we have seen in the past year alone?
Absolutely. I mean, a long history, unfortunately. Most Sudanese and even the general public outside of Sudan know their roots, right? I mean, the majority of the RSF forces were the Janjaweed, this infamous force that came about to target the rebel forces in Darfur. And this has caused a lot of problems.
It's caused a lot of problems. Here we are being joined by Mr. Ahmad Mclad, an analyst from Sydney. Mr. Mclad, we're just getting news that a press conference has announced that the talks are back on track between the opposition and the Military Transitional Council. What is your analysis of the situation as it deteriorated rapidly in the past 48 hours after those 5 individuals were shot dead, allegedly by the RSF?
Well, we just also added one more died in a separate incident in the middle of Khartoum by another RSF personnel. We expect the situation of unrest. When you have an inorganized militias, I'm still using the word militias because they're not organized part of the Sudanese military. They still just a militias came out from nowhere and they just occupied the capital of Sudan. We expect such things to happen and to continue happening as much as they are allowed to stay in the middle of Khartoum, in the middle of the eyes of the whole world.
Right.
They're continuing to do lots of abuses outside the cameras, which is not known worldwide. The Sudanese people, they live with that. They avoid them as much as they can. They abuse, they break in, they take, they detain without any legal grounds. They just, taking Khartoum as as an occupation, nothing more, nothing less.
Couldn't this possibly become an impediment to any kind of progress expected with TMC and the opposition parties? Because it seems almost that there is a dire need for security sector reforms, as the RSF doesn't seem to be very much in control of the acting Vice President, General Al-Burhan.
100%. Well, any politician who knows, really about politics will know that security is an important part. You can't, rule a country without having security, in your side. And that's the challenge here, is that Al-Burhan is on top of the military rule now. It's hijacked in a way. And we want the Sudanese military back to us. We want that, but we're having difficulty. That's why the negotiation has to continue. The negotiations hopefully will not be, a reason for them to stabilize the rule. What I refer here to is the RSF with Al-Burhan. They seem like they want, two faces for the same coin. Al-Burhan and the RSF, they one thing. And we're hoping that this negotiations will take us out of this critical situation of the Sudanese, political, situation or medium now.
Okay, so we've also one quick question here. Is it possible that international intervention here might be able to help the situation, especially when there's such a huge distrust? And I'm not just talking about how Egypt and UAE is playing a role. I'm talking about further west, if you're going to look at maybe the US or Europe.
Well, I think everyone is taking a side, waiting to, waiting for the Sudanese people to take an action. And that's what we rely on. We rely on what our people will do more than anything else. The Egyptians, the Emiratis, they have their own agenda, which we all know, and they're pushing hard on keeping the military rule in Sudan. And we're not trusting them in any way. What's happening is the Ethiopian government and the African Union and the African countries, actually, they played a positive role. We will always be indebted for them. They have played a positive role, and they continue to do that. Forcing the negotiations to go further.
It will turn out positively.
That will make to a positive change.
Okay, Mr. McCloud there joining us from Sydney. Thank you much for your time. Also, Mr. Tom Rhodes, who was joining us from Nairobi. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for now. We will see you next week. Till then, goodbye.